What happens when you think you have your life all planned out and all of a sudden a demon from your past comes back to haunt you? In this story, a beautiful and loving family experiences the cold brunt of revenge and murder. Set in a quiet neighborhood, this tragic tale unfolds behind the walls of how a seemingly perfect family pay for a crime they didn't commit. This is the story of Angela, Sophie, and Ethan, whose lives are about to be changed based on an action someone took years ago. The moon hung high, casting a silvery glow over the quiet suburban street. Inside a modest home, Angela moved through the house with a practiced rhythm, carrying the weight of her responsibilities like a second skin. In the dim light of the living room, toys were scattered across the floor, remnants of her youngest daughter's playful chaos. Angela bent down, picking them up with a faint smile before heading upstairs. She found Grace, her 10-year-old, nestled under a blanket, clutching a worn stuffed bunny. "Time for bed, sweetheart," Angela said softly. Grace yawned, her eyes fluttering. "Will you read me a story?" Angela sat beside her, brushing a stray curl from Grace's face. "Not tonight, baby. It's late. Sleep now." She kissed her forehead, tucking the blanket around her snugly. In the adjacent room, Sophie, her 16-year-old, was sprawled on her bed, her phone glowing in the dark. Music played faintly in the background as she scrolled through social media. Angela lingered in the doorway, watching her eldest with a mixture of pride and worry. "Good night, girls," she whispered. "Night, Mom," Sophie replied without looking up. Grace murmured something incoherent, already drifting into sleep. Angela stepped into the hallway, her gaze falling on a family photo hanging on the wall. The picture captured her and the girls smiling brightly during a summer picnic. Yet there was an unmistakable void. The absence of a father figure loomed in the frame, a silent reminder of the fragmented family they had become. Angela's eyes lingered on Sophie, her smile in the photo a reflection of innocence that Angela desperately wanted to protect. She sighed, turning off the lights as she made her way to her room, unaware of the storm quietly brewing in the shadows of their lives. But to understand the true depth of this story, we must go back. Back to a time before Angela gave birth to Sophie and Grace, and to the moment that everything changed. The summer heat bore down mercilessly, the sun casting shadows on the cracked pavement of an empty lot. David stood at the center, his fists clenched and his jaw tight, facing Thomas, a man he had once considered a friend. The air between them was electric, charged with years of unspoken grievances. "You've crossed the line, David," Thomas growled, his voice heavy with anger and betrayal. "You think you can just do what you want and walk away?" David's eyes narrowed. "Don't lecture me about doing things, Thomas. You're no saint." The tension snapped like a frayed wire as Thomas lunged forward, shoving David hard. David stumbled, but regained his footing, his expression darkening. The confrontation spiraled, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusations and threats. Then it happened. A flash of steel glinted in the sunlight as Thomas drew a knife from his pocket, his hand trembling, but resolute. "Stay away from my family," he warned, his voice shaking with both fear and determination. David's instincts kicked in. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "Put it down, Thomas. Don't make me do this," he said, his voice low and steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. Thomas advanced, and in a blur of motion, their fight escalated. The clang of metal against metal echoed through the empty lot as David blocked a strike with the pipe. In the chaos, Thomas slipped, his footing faltering on the uneven ground. David swung the pipe, his actions driven more by instinct than intent. The sickening crack of impact silenced everything. Thomas collapsed, the knife falling from his hand. Blood pooled beneath him as David stood frozen, the pipe slipping from his grasp. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he stared at the lifeless body of the man he had just killed. Panic surged through him, But even as his mind raced, he knew what he had to do. When the police arrived, David's account was clear: self-defense. The knife, the bruises, and the witnesses to their argument painted a complicated picture, but it was enough to sway the court. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension, as the judge's gavel struck wood. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of anger, disbelief, and resignation. David sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of calm indifference. He wore a suit that seemed out of place on him, his hands folded neatly as though the weight of the trial didn't bear down on him. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony provided, the judge began, his deep voice commanding silence, this court finds the defendant, David Parker, not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. The room erupted. On one side, David's legal team exchanged triumphant nods, while on the other, Thomas's widow let out a guttural cry that silenced even the loudest whispers. Ethan and Clara, huddled beside her, stared ahead blankly, their young faces pale with shock. David stood, his lawyer patting him on the back, but he didn't smile. His gaze flickered toward the grieving family for a brief moment before he turned away, walking out of the courtroom as a free man. The echo of his footsteps seemed louder than the uproar that followed him. Ethan's small hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he watched David leave. "How could they?" he whispered, his voice trembling with rage. Clara buried her face in their mother's side, sobbing quietly, while their mother's grief morphed into a silent, simmering fury. Outside, reporters swarmed David, microphones thrust into his face. "Mr. Parker, any comment on today's verdict?" one of them asked. David's jaw tightened. "I've said everything I need to in court. Now, if you'll excuse me." He pushed past them, his freedom feeling heavier than the chains of guilt that bound him. He walked free, but the weight of what he had done remained, haunting him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Back inside the courtroom, Ethan sat by his mother's side, clutching her hand as she sobbed uncontrollably, his mind replaying the judge's words over and over, "Not guilty." To him they weren't just words, they were a betrayal, a declaration that justice was a fragile, fickle thing. His father was gone, and his world would never be the same. That day something inside him hardened, setting the stage for the storm that would come years later. It had been years since the tragedy that had shattered Ethan's world. Time had dulled the pain, but sharpened his resolve. Gone was the boy who had once believed in love, family, and fairness. In his place stood a man hardened by loss, his every thought consumed by one burning desire: revenge. Ethan had spent years rebuilding himself. He'd changed his name, his appearance, and even his mannerisms. Now, as Eli, he was no longer the vulnerable boy who had been destroyed. He was a calculated predator, ready to strike. And Sophie, her innocence, her obliviousness to her father's sins, made her the perfect target. It began innocuously enough. Ethan, or Eli as he now called himself, created a fake social media profile. It was easy to slip into Sophie's online world, to watch her through the window she unknowingly left open. He scrolled through her posts, piecing together her life like a puzzle. Photos of Sophie at the university library, check-ins at coffee shops, stories about her late-night study sessions or weekend trips with friends. It didn't take long for him to learn her routines, her favorite spots, her quirks. Ethan didn't rush. He knew revenge required patience. For months he followed her silently, observing, waiting for the perfect moment to insert himself into her life. The opportunity came one crisp autumn afternoon. Sophie was sitting in the corner of a bustling campus cafe, her laptop open, her fingers dancing over the keyboard. Ethan approached her table with a disarming smile, coffee in hand. "Hey," he said, feigning nervousness. "Sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing you're in my psychology class, right? Dr. Carson's seminar?" Sophie looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to place him. Ethan chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "I usually sit in the back. Eli, by the way." "Oh." Sophie smiled politely. "Yeah, I think I've seen you. Nice to meet you." The conversation flowed naturally after that. Ethan had spent weeks studying her interests, her likes, her dislikes. He knew exactly what to say, when to laugh, and how to steer the conversation to keep her intrigued. By the time they parted ways, Sophie had given him her number. It didn't take long for Ethan to worm his way into Sophie's life. He became the charming, attentive boyfriend she had always dreamed of. He brought her flowers just because. He remembered every small detail she shared with him, from her favorite childhood book to the way she liked her coffee. To Sophie's mother, Angela, Eli seemed perfect, too perfect. Angela's suspicions were subtle at first, a lingering unease she couldn't quite shake. It was the way Eli seemed so fascinated by their family photos when he visited their home, the way his gaze lingered on her late husband's face, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. One evening, as Angela watched him interact with Sophie, her stomach churned with doubt. There was something in the way he spoke, so measured, so calculated, that felt off. "Eli," she said, her voice casual as she set a tray of tea on the coffee table, "you seem very interested in our family history." Eli smiled, the perfect picture of charm. "Oh, I just think it's fascinating. Every family has a story, right? It's nice to know where people come from." But Angela wasn't convinced. As the weeks went on, her unease grew. She noticed the way Eli seemed to always know what Sophie was doing, where she'd be, even before she mentioned it. One night, Angela walked into the living room to find Eli standing by the mantelpiece, staring at an old family photo. It was one she hadn't seen him notice before, a picture of her late husband, Sophie, as a child, and herself on a sunny day at the lake. "You have a beautiful family," Eli said without turning around, his voice calm but laced with something unspoken. "Thank you," Angela replied, her tone cautious. Eli's fingers traced the edge of the photo frame. "Must be hard, losing someone like that." Angela's chest tightened. "It is, but we've managed." Eli turned to her then, his eyes locking onto hers. For a fleeting moment, Angela saw something cold, something dangerous in his gaze. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual warmth. But the moment lingered in her mind, planting seeds of doubt she couldn't ignore. Even Sophie, blinded by infatuation, couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. Eli was everything she had ever wanted in a partner, but there were moments when his intensity unsettled her. It was in the way he seemed to always be one step ahead, knowing her schedule before she told him. The way his mood would darken whenever she mentioned her father. One night, as they lay on the couch watching a movie, Sophie asked, "Eli, do you ever feel like you know too much about me?" Eli turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "Just, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're always watching, like you know what I'm thinking before I even say it." Eli chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's what happens when you really care about someone, Sophie. You pay attention." His words were sweet, but they didn't ease the unease growing in Sophie's heart. Sophie sat across from Eli at their favorite cafe, stirring sugar into her latte. The conversation was light, the atmosphere warm, yet something simmered beneath the surface of Eli's calm exterior. He watched her intently, his fingers gripping the edge of his cup with just a little too much force. "And honestly," Sophie said, her voice carrying a soft laugh, "I owe everything to my dad. He was the most supportive, loving person I could have ever asked for. He always knew how to make me feel safe, like no matter what happened, I'd be okay." Her words hit him like a sledgehammer. His chest tightened, and a cold fury began to rise within him. "Safe?" he thought bitterly. "She feels safe because of the man who destroyed me?" Eli's jaw clenched, and his knuckles turned white, as he held his cup. "Your father sounds like he was perfect," he said, his voice tight. Sophie didn't notice the shift in his tone. She smiled wistfully. "He really was. I wish you could have met him. He would have loved you." Eli swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he murmured, "I'm sure he would have." But inside, the storm was raging. The next evening, Sophie invited Eli over to her apartment for dinner. She hummed softly as she prepared the meal, oblivious to the growing tension in the room. Eli sat at the dining table, his eyes following her every move, his thoughts spiraling deeper into the abyss of his anger and pain. As they sat down to eat, Eli set his fork down and leaned back, his expression dark and unreadable. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and steady, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, startled by his sudden seriousness. "Of course. What's wrong?" He hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "Do you ever wonder if people aren't who they say they are?" Sophie frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Eli's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I mean, sometimes people wear masks. They pretend to be someone else, someone better. But deep down, they're hiding something, something they can't let go of." Sophie tilted her head, concern flickering in her eyes. "Eli, what's going on? You're scaring me." Eli exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You know, Sophie, I've been carrying something with me for years, something your father gave me." Her heart skipped a beat. "My father? Eli, you're not making any sense." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Your father destroyed my life." Sophie froze, the color draining from her face. "What are you talking about? My dad would never—" "Would never what?" Eli snapped, his voice rising. "Ruin someone's family? Lie to save his own skin? Leave someone to rot while he lived happily with his perfect little family?" Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as she shook her head. "No, you're wrong. That's not who he was. He wasn't like that." Eli laughed bitterly, standing up and pacing the room. "Of course you'd say that. You lived in a fairy tale while I was living in a nightmare. Your father's lies killed my family, Sophie, and now you're going to pay for his sins." Sophie backed away, her hands trembling as she tried to process his words. "Eli, please, you don't have to do this. I don't even understand." "Of course you don't," Eli interrupted, turning to face her. His face was a mask of cold rage. "But don't worry. Once you're on the other side, I'm sure your father will explain everything to you." Her breath hitched, and she stumbled backward, her eyes darting to the door. "Eli, please, you don't have to do this. We can talk." But Eli was already moving, his steps deliberate, his hand reaching into his pocket to pull out the knife he had carried for months. "Talk?" he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and anguish. "Do you have any idea how long I've waited for this? How many nights I spent dreaming of this moment?" Sophie's back hit the wall, and she raised her hands in a desperate plea. "Eli, I didn't do anything. I didn't even know." "That's the point," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You didn't know because you didn't care. None of you did. You lived your perfect little lives while I lost everything." He lunged forward, and Sophie screamed, her voice piercing the air as the blade plunged into her chest. Her eyes widened in shock, tears streaming down her face as she gasped for breath. "Eli, why?" she choked out, her voice barely audible. Eli knelt beside her, his face inches from hers. "Because your father took everything from me," he whispered. "And now I've taken everything from him." Sophie's body went limp, her head lolling to the side as the life drained from her eyes. Eli stood slowly, his hands trembling, as he looked down at her lifeless form. For a moment, the weight of what he had done settled on him, but then he turned and walked away, leaving the blood-stained room in silence. The sound of the door opening broke the silence. Angela stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the quiet space. She hadn't heard from Sophie in hours, and a gnawing feeling had started to take root in her stomach. Something felt wrong. she called out softly, "Sophie?" When there was no response, she approached the bed, her pulse quickening with every step. And then she saw it, the blood, the crimson stain spreading across the sheets, soaking into the fabric like a nightmare made real. Angela's breath caught in her throat, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached out for Sophie's body. But as her hand hovered over the lifeless form, the truth hit her like a sledgehammer. Sophie was gone. Sophie was dead. Angela staggered back, her world spinning. "No, no," she screamed, her voice high and ragged. She fell to her knees beside the bed, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone, dialing the police. "Help, please. Someone. My daughter." Hours later, the house was a scene of chaos. Police officers swarmed the room, forensic experts snapping photos, collecting evidence, and trying to piece together the gruesome puzzle that had unfolded. The detectives worked in quiet determination, but the weight of the tragedy hung in the air like a thick fog. Angela sat in the living room, her face pale, her eyes hollow, as the officers interrogated her. The disbelief in her voice was clear. "Eli! He couldn't have—" She shook her head, as if trying to deny the reality that was now set in stone. But the evidence didn't lie. A search of the premises had led to crucial discoveries. A blood-stained knife, the faint traces of Eli's fingerprints on the doorframe, and a series of messages found on Sophie's phone, leading investigators to a chilling conclusion. Eli's true identity was uncovered, a man whose life had been shattered by her father's actions. The investigation revealed his motives, the deep-rooted pain and desire for revenge that had driven him to murder. Sophie, by mere association, had become his target. Eli was arrested in a quiet apartment on the outskirts of town, the final act in a twisted saga of vengeance that had taken years to unfold. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he showed no emotion. The fire of vengeance had finally burned out, leaving only the ashes of what once was. Do well to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more chilling crime tales. And we'll see you in our next video.